Hi, Carlton King, former Scotland Yard Special Branch and MI6 officer and the author of Black Ops.
I was undercover for Special Branch in the jihadi organisation.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes or Google Patreon Black Spy podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe for free.
My name is Carlton King, and welcome to the Black Spy Podcast, the show that shines a light on the world of secret intelligence, national security, and armed governmental personal protection operations, but actually majors in on geopolitics, particularly the geopolitics of how the secret world functions, indeed how the world functions in general, who controls it. And this is part 2 of what I would say is a view of how the world is. The view provided by the elites to us, the average people. Psychological operations, it's often called revisionism when it's taken into hands by others. Often distortion, and it's part of one of my critical thinking processes, which I generally do at the end of or mid part of a season. So welcome to season 11. Thank you for staying with us, and please, hopefully you will subscribe. Obviously next week I'll have Fergus back with me, but this week, as again, I want to just continue, as I said last week, looking at the perspective of how we perceive our world and how much of that is our own thinking and how much of it is thinking given by others. So this is part 2. So in part 1 we overviewed the Second World War. We looked at the First World War. We looked at how at the end of the Second World War we were made to think that we in the West had won it by ourselves, nigh on. The Soviets were written out of it, even though their death levels were like 50 times ours. And even though most of the Germans who lost their life in the Second World War lost their lives on the Eastern Front. I spoke about Africa, how that was split up. I spoke about who decides what race somebody is, even though, as I said, race is a biological nonsense, but however a political reality, so that's why I have to use the word race. Other than that, I wouldn't bother using it, because I'd say it was stupidity. But unfortunately, it's something that we do. And then I looked at, the suffragette movement, and I looked at how in the suffragette movement that what they were seeking was not universal suffrage for everybody, because there wasn't universal suffrage for all men by any means, and the vast majority of men, example in the First World War, went to their deaths not having the right to vote, in Britain at least. So I looked at that, and I looked at how Mrs. Pankhurst was looking for suffrage for women in line with those of men, i.e. not universal suffrage, but those of the elite who should have a right to vote because they were property owning classes or married to those with property owners, etc., and middle class, etc. And that was the original movement for suffragettes. And we spoke about suffragettes being perceived as terrorists, but not, and wondering whether what one would do with their own thing if we felt that we were undermined, would we be terrorists as well? So we looked at that, and how the nations or the powers that be make people perceive how others are. And I think I ended on, spoke about French colonialism, which I wanted to get into more, and I will do here because we wanted to talk about Niger and how it feeds into the modern day. So let's just hit Niger now, because by this time it may well be the case that ECOWAG, the West African economic organisation, Oceanic Forum, which it is, that was talking about carrying out some actions against the Nigerian military who'd taken over from the civilian government, if it didn't put the civilian government back in place. Now, what I will say is this. Because of those colonial perspectives in the past, and I want you to be able to see how we're using, again, bad government, carrying out coup against the government. But what nobody questions is, why is it that, in Niger example, that the French government takes 95%, yes, you heard me correctly, 95% of the monies that come from the uranium, and the Nigerian government only takes 5%. So that this fuel, basically, that is utilised to provide 7.5% from Niger, precisely 7.5% of France's energy throughout the whole of France, is not used to provide energy in Niger. Why the government, French government and French businesses that run that hardly use any local capacity to extract these ores out of the ground. Why the monies from that end up in France. Why indeed the money under the CFA, the French, which used to be called the colonial French African franc, but why that money that is earned in France, why half of it has to go by decree, and that's not in Niger, that's for 14 other African countries, be that in West Africa and Central Africa, which were one-time French colonies, why by decree, when they got independence in the 60s, they had to sign to say that the only people that could print their money would be France. And that of their money, which they had because of their assets, 50% at any one time had to sit in France, in French banks. That they had to be controlled by the French banking system. And that at any one stage, if they wanted anything from it, they could only get 20% of it at any one stage. And in doing that 20%, it was effectively like a loan for their own money. Let me say that again. They were effectively loaning 20% of it from their own money. And then had to pay for those loans of their own money that leaves them indebted. So why would they agree to that? Why would any sensible person agree to that? So first and foremost, you're hardly getting any of the product in the first place, of the monies from the product, because you've agreed that 95% of it goes to France. Now, in some countries it was less, I think up to 75%, but generally it's around about the case 90% goes to France. So you've agreed that. So on the money that you do make, because some of them have small populations, so would still be doing well, no, it doesn't go to the country. It goes into the hands of the leader. So that 5%, the leaders agreed it, because the 5% goes to the leading elite. So in Niger example, 75% of the population have no electricity, right? There was no agreement for, even if the French did it, for the French to build a nuclear power station there so that they could have power. No agreement made whatsoever. What's even worse is when you start looking at French colonial history, because they turned around and said, you know, you could always come to France for your education. And, as I said before, you did see French black people do well in some domains, the few that could get out. So, but because of that, we didn't bother building schools in your country. So I believe there was one university, well, in fact, none. Mali, the Great Mali Empire. So before France was even a powerful country, you had the Great Mali Empire. It was a great empire, and the king of that empire, well, Emperor Mansa Kaka Musa, example, destroyed the gold standard in Egypt for 20 years. Because when he travelled with so much gold that the gold standard was destroyed. You'll see on a Portuguese map in the 14th century, you'll see him holding a golden orb and holding the world in his hand, because he's the wealthiest man in the world's ever seen. 20,000 retinue of individuals followed him. So that's what you see. However, and this is the interesting part to this, In Mali, you've got a place called Timbuktu, which is a university. One of the oldest universities in the world, to be fair, with historic books there from ages gone by. Malian script, in an old-fashioned script they had, and also much in Arabic script when they were Muslims. Centre of learning, centre of education, etc., etc., etc. But in that whole country of Mali, subsequently, when the French took over, they made not one university. Not one. So it was only 20 years after the freedom of Mali, if you will, the liberation, its independence, that it was able to build its own universities again. Education, limited. And that went for basically the other 14 former French colonies. Education, very, very limited. Because there was no interest to educate the people. Those that wanted educating come to France, because you will be educated in the French way to do things and feel as a French person, and therefore you will not want to free your country from France, because you'll say, oh, that is my country, it's my mother country. Now, don't get me wrong, we had the same case in Britain, and maybe the British just didn't do it as good. Maybe they just didn't make people think they were British enough. Maybe there was an angle that felt, oh, well, we're not British, so maybe we'll try and get rid of them. But the French basically did what the Romans did and made you a citizen. So this is how, again, the psychological ops work. It's what do you need in order to control the individuals you've got. This is all individuals, don't get me wrong. It's not just a colour thing. Obviously, French people with little advantage had exactly the same problem. But, and this is the big but, and I think this is what the Irish people found. And you often hear people say, oh, we were Irish people, this is, and I've got Irish heritage. You often hear people say, oh, well, we were treated badly as well. We were nigh on slaves. Well, there's a big thing between nigh on and slaves, two completely different things, of course. But don't get me wrong, the story of blacks isn't just slavery, and I should say that at this point very quickly, because the word slave actually comes from the word Slav. And, of course, if you know about anything about the Barbary pirates, who were Africans who sailed around, even as far as, well, obviously sailed around many parts of the world, but if you're talking about Western Europe, even as far as down into Cornwall, and used to steal the women away and the men away from Cornwall, enslave the men, have the women as concubines, which is one of the reasons why people say that the North Africans are so mixed, because they took so many European people, particularly from Northern European areas, took so many of them, and they married into the ruling elite, or were used as concubines by the ruling elite, and their children then became somebody of import, because there's nothing stopping them being powerful subsequently. But again, this is hardly ever spoken about. You hear white slavery as though it's something new. No, this is going back years. This was done many years ago. This was done 200 years ago. So that trade was happening in the same way. But the difference was that trade wasn't a trade like in the western part of the world that meant you could never rise up. See, because what the Americans did, I think it was the Maryland, and I say look it up yourself, as I always do say, I think it was the Maryland legal authority that brought out this rule that said that the children of a slave are themselves slaves. See, up until then, nobody had ever really said that under any system. I don't care if it's Roman or Egyptian or Arab, who are mixed race people anyway, Arabic or whatever it might be, or African, whatever the system was. Nobody had ever really said there is a slave class of people who always and immutably will stay as slaves forever. Right? That is what you are. You're born one, you will be one forever. That never happened to the Irish. Indeed, what happens is with the Irish, although they were nothing in Great Britain, Arthur Wolseley says it the best. The Duke of Wellington, for those who don't know his actual name, said it the best. Because he was born in Ireland, he had to find his way around it. And what he actually said was, because you're born in a barn it doesn't make you a horse. Because he didn't want to be an Irishman. Right? But put the Irishman into the Caribbean now, and if the Irishman was the same as the black person, who's now been given this immutable status of always enslaved, because originally it wasn't like that in the 16th centuries, 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. In fact, even blacks had slaves, who some of them were white, or indentured servants. Actually, not slaves fully, but indentured servants. And owned other slaves, enslaved blacks. What it meant was that if you then had a white person, Irish, who was then lower than a black person, you undermine the system. So thereby, the moment that Irish person stepped off that boat, even if he was and she was the worst of the worst back in Britain, this goes for the British colonies now. This is not necessarily for the French or Portuguese or Spanish colonies. It was somewhat different because, of course, they were already mixed race. This is the problem. This is the point I was making on the last episode. Because they were of some mixed race, many of them, Portuguese, Southern French in particular, Spaniards, particularly Spanish and Portuguese, mixed race, Sicilians, mixed race, other Southern Italians, mixed race. Because of that, it would be difficult to turn around and say blacks bad, because you never knew in your own family when you might get somebody who's looking black, particularly light-skinned black. So you might get, as in Brazil example, a black person is only somebody who's absolutely fully black, which is what you get, by the way, in places like Saudi Arabia or somewhere like that, because it's totally mixed race. The only ones who are classed as black are those who are absolutely black. And then you can say, oh, those are blacks, but we are something different. Do you see what I'm saying? Because that's upholding the system. Right. Now, in Britain, they didn't feel they had that, albeit that there'd been Roman legionnaires who'd been over there 2,000 years ago and had children, but that generally died out within the British population, albeit that it was, Moors came across and various others came across and supplanted a different racial element into the British. At the time we're talking about of the primary slave trades, most people were white, they looked white, and in that moment, then your best bet for you as a poor white guy was to get on a boat and end up in a colony somewhere, and in the colony you were the king. I don't care whether that colony was in India or whether that colony was in the West Indies, because you had whiteness on your side. So when people turn around and say, oh, as an Irishman we had all the problems, yeah, but once you left, and even if you went as an indentured servant for a while, you were then released, then you were free, then nobody knew who you were, what you could do. And if you changed the accent altogether and said you weren't Irish, then who knew any difference? I'm an Englishman. Then you're good to go. And people passed. Don't get me wrong. Irish people pretending they weren't Irish. You know that. The same way as light-skinned black people passed and said they were Portuguese, said they were Spanish, said they were whatever, in order to pass. Right? And that in itself shows you that the Spaniards are mixed race, because people passed as Spaniards. Yeah. The same, by the way, goes for the apartheid system. Nobody, and I'm going to have later on in the show, maybe about in 2 or 3 episodes' time, I want to get back onto the show Fergus's mother, who was born in South Africa, and she will explain to you that amongst the Dutch, which then became known as the Boer, the Dutch farmer, the Dutch South African, people didn't want to look too closely, because the original people, when they came over in 1625, I think it was, the Cape of Good Hope, were dying out, and they then took wives from amongst the indigenous peoples down there. And that's what kept them alive, which is why you ended up with things with people called Cape Coloureds, example. Mixed race people, basically. Right. And if you looked too closely at some of the so-called whites under apartheid, you might find that actually they're not white. To be fair, this study's done in places like Louisiana, places like Georgia, where's the other one where it happened a lot? Texas, obviously, California, places a little bit less in but places down in some Florida southern parts where if you look very, very closely, people being white were not white, and that could mean a complete change of their life. So people didn't want to look too closely, because under Jim Crow laws after the Civil War and the presidential reconstruction, and then the president didn't really do very much at all to change the product, but then the second reconstructive period, which was called a radical reconstruction in the South after the Civil War. After that period when Jim Crow laws came back in and the white Southerners tried to take back power, because in the time of the radical reconstruction in the South, you had blacks who were senators, example. When that radical reconstruction took part by force of arms, some people said 100,000 people died to bring it back to where it was under Jim Crow. Then what you would find is, and Jim Crow, by the way, is a picture of a black guy who was basically, he's a minstrel, by the way, the black and white minstrel shows which they used to have. Jim Crow was the minstrel that he was based on. A black guy who was kind of furtive, feckless, useless, a planter's version of what black should be. And after slavery had ended, you had to try and keep blacks down, so you wanted visions of black people who were negative. So this stereotype, Jim Crow, was it, and then they called the laws Jim Crow laws to keep Jim Crow down, right? Who was this so-called archetypal black guy, feckless individual, worthless individual. So what you find is that, and this is the point, what you find is that in doing all of this, it's again using that psychological perspective. It's putting in the normal person's mind what this type of individual is, or what this type of person is, or what this type of country might be. So now we jump forward, as I said, we've got these 14 countries, including Niger, that are run by France, and people thought nothing of the fact that the French are ripping them off day in, day out, because of course, well, maybe the French needed to put a stabilising system in place so they wouldn't waste their money. You see how you can utilise a vision to justify a process, because if we don't take half their money and we don't charge them for getting their own money back, they'll spend it recklessly. Not them not being allowed to utilise their money, and if they do step out of line, us sending our armies in to make sure we replace this particular leader with another leader who will do our bidding and who will take the 5% in a Swiss bank account and will be happy to suppress his people so he can live well and his family can live well. Yeah, if you don't get that and we attack you then and undermine you or assassinate your leader, because we've kept you poor, there's enough people who are willing to say, I'll take that job on, and then I'll look after myself. I'll become the president and I'll do whatever you want, France. Right? This is how it works, but that's not the story they're telling. The story they're telling is we are keeping them honest. We are making sure they don't utilise their monies incorrectly. After all, they don't really know what they're doing. So it's that, what I call the muck of ages, that allows you to pretend you're actually doing something positive when actually all you're really doing is looking after yourself, in terms of France, looking after the French, and undermining the former colonies that they've had and stealing from them their goods. So these are the psychological ops which we have to be aware of. So what else is there where we can see this today? Well, obviously, one is Ukraine. And I know some people are going to turn around and say, oh no, Carlton, what are you doing, this Ukraine? Are you some sort of Soviet guy? No, I'm not a Russian guy. No, I'm not some sort of Russian guy. All I am is a person who looks at the reality of the situation And I can see very, very clearly, quite rightly, that right-wing, right supremacists were a fundamental part of the Ukraine. Now, was that the reason why President Putin turned around and said, we need to defeat these right-wing Nazis because they are right-wing nationalists, right-wing white racists? Maybe, maybe not. Clearly fascism plays a part, because he would be perceiving, albeit that he's not a communist in any way, shape or means, he would be perceiving, hey, listen, these are the guys. Now, don't get me wrong, because the Ukrainians were also part of the Soviet Union, and the Ukrainians also died in the Red Army. But there were enough Ukrainians who did not, and who fought on the side of the Germans, and who exterminated Red Army individuals, regardless of where they might have come from. Right? So, what you've got to look at is this. But let's look at the neocons in the United States, neoconservatives. And I guess we first start hearing about these neocons way back, really, in the 1960s civil rights movements, 1950s, to be fair. Basically, they are what we would call in the old days the nativist parties and the nativist perspective. And by nativism in the United States, what it means is the people who saw themselves as white Anglo-Saxons who believed that the United States should be a land just for white Anglo-Saxons. They hated, example, Italians, who they saw as blacks in the beginning, coming through. They really made little differentiation until, again, the same with Hispanics, really made little differentiation, was seen as blacks, until subsequently the federal government, look it up, in terms of the Hispanics, they were perceived to be non-whites 3 different times, and then put back into the white category, then out of the white, and then back. Because, of course, there are white Hispanics, who look white. Same with the Italians. Originally, some of them were classed non-white and put in with the blacks. And then we'll revamp them, and revamp then. Because, of course, Northern Italians look different than many Southern Italians. So this is not straightforward. You need to understand how this has been perceived throughout the ages. And American laws, who believe in eugenics, and they have done for quite some time, you will see how they have ebbed and flowed with the eugenical ideas of who is an Aryan and who isn't. That's why the North American Nazi Party was a big party during the 30s and the 40s. This is why they didn't want to fight the war on the side of the British, example. So you need to look at that. So these neocons have come in, and they believe in Pax Americana, the great American powers, that they should rule the world and they should be in charge of everything. And of course, that was allowed to be the case, because during the Second World War, where hundreds of thousands of blacks donned on the uniform, if not a million, to on the side of the fight on the side of the American. Many were not allowed to fight, but were given dastardly jobs within the US forces. But then some were allowed to fight, and did fight, and fought with distinction in many different areas, as they had done in the First World War. Indeed, it was said by Wilson, President Wilson after that, do not, to the French, don't give these blacks all these medals you're giving them, above and beyond white soldiers, because the black American fought well, and the French gave them, croix de guerre for their fighting abilities. In fact, I can tell you a story. I don't know if I've told you before, but I will tell you. I told you that I knew many Germans who had been in the Second World War, and I knew quite a few Americans who lived in Germany who had been in the Second World War. I remember one guy, he flew for the Red Tails, flying a Mustang P-45s, and he was escorting the American bombers over Germany when he was hit. He's coming down and he thought, I'm going to get it here, because he'd been fed the propaganda that basically once you land in Germany, it's like landing in the South back in the times of slavery. So he's landing down, he said, I had my pistol there, and he landed badly, and he'd been hit anyway, and he landed badly, and the Germans were already there. And he said this German guy, who he could see from the insignia was a Captain Hauptmann. This German guy saluted him and said, and he was a captain in the US military, because the Red Tails were the one unit. It was an all-black unit, but with actually black officers as well. So he was an officer, because he's a pilot, and he was a captain, and he said the fellow stood to attention to him, the German, and said, Hauptmann, the war's over for you, and saluted him. And he said that's the first time he was ever saluted by a white soldier. Because, of course, the only soldiers he'd been amongst were the white American soldiers, other than his black soldiers, and they never once, they just called him the N-word. So, with this all going on in the South, how was it that America, by the rest of the world, was called the land of the free? How was it that in Britain we'd hear all the time, and I heard it when I was a kid, the leader of the free world? Well, how can you be the leader of the free world when your people can't even go to school? When, in that time, probably about a quarter of the American population was black, when a quarter of your population doesn't have the right to drink from the same place you can drink, doesn't have the right to get the same education as you, doesn't get the right to sit on the train as you, doesn't get the right to employment as you, doesn't get the right to live in any area it wants to live like you do. How can you be the leader of the free world when you just fought a war supposedly to stop racism? In fact, Hermann Göring said this. It's quite interesting. Hermann Göring said this at the Nuremberg trials. He said, what about your Negroes? He said, you talk about the Jews, he said, you don't talk about the gypsies, but you talk about the Jews, but what about your Negro? What's the difference? So this is a situation. This is how America was able to get away with it. Again, we come back to the psychological ops. Because if you make blacks worth nothing, then it's not a problem. So how does this feed into Ukraine? Because they're using the same perspective against Russians. Russians are bloodthirsty. Putin is terrible. Putin is doing this. Putin doing that. Notice no president in front of it. Putin this, that and t'other. Right? When, if you sat down and looked at it from the perspective of President Putin, which is what I did when I was in the system, I always looked at what is the other person's perspective. Because then I can defeat that enemy, if he is an enemy, or I can co-opt that enemy and bring him to my side. Yeah. But what is his or her perspective? So if you are a Russian, no longer Soviet Union now, gone, so you're Russia, and you see NATO, which at the time of the 1989 downing of the wall and the reunification of the two Germanys in the 1990s, at that time it was said loud and clear by the US Secretary of State, okay, so that's the Foreign Secretary to us Brits, US Foreign Secretary, it was said NATO will not move 1 inch, and I'm quoting now, 1 inch further outside of Germany. By the end of President Clinton, he'd basically had a lot of what used to be Soviet Warsaw Pact, i.e. the countries that were part of the communist system who were not the Soviet Union. Those countries saw what used to be Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, etc. Those countries were part of Warsaw Pact. So who is then the enemy? Because what you've got to understand is, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, all of a sudden, Russia under Yeltsin, is no longer communist. So there isn't an enemy then, is there? Because we were fighting communism in the past. So these capitalist Russians, why are they the enemy? So why do we need a NATO? Why do we need it? The enemy's gone, it's defeated, over, finished. Why do we need a NATO? But nobody wants to ask that question, do they? And then in the end, why do we want to bring Ukraine into the NATO? With Nazi sympathies, which many of them had, and that's reality. You can look it up. There was at least 3 programs done by the BBC, okay, several years ago, talking about the Nazis in Ukraine. You won't see them now, but look them up on YouTube. You can see, put in BBC Nazis, and you'll see Ukraine, and they'll come up, programs. So why is it that we are now being told something completely different? And how is it that the newspapers can get this so wrong? How is it that the newspapers can say the Ukraine's winning when they're clearly losing? You know, even if regardless of what you think of the war, You know, you got military specialists come on TV, and I cringe and I say, mate, how can you put your actual good name on the line and espouse a load of rubbish when you can absolutely see that Russia is winning? How can you turn around, and that's from day one, how could you turn around and say this, that, no? I had prophesied, and I'm not being a clue shizer, I had said, and I'm on record, you can see my first podcast about the Russia-Ukraine war, and I said what Russia wants is the regions of eastern Ukraine which are by far populated by Russian-speaking Ukrainians. That's what I said. So it's not me making it up. That's what their interest is. And I also said President Putin will have learnt, and I can't know what he's thinking, but will have learnt from what happened in two wars where I was, Afghanistan and Iraq, all the time. He will have learnt from those wars, you can win the war, but you will lose the peace. If you try to occupy a land, once it's been provided with arms, if you try to occupy that land where the people do not want you, you will fight a war of insurgency forever and a day. And in the end, you will leave defeated, which is what's happened to us in Afghanistan and Iraq. Okay? That basically is what happened. Because otherwise you're going to have to be prepared to leave 1 million men sat there in that country being blown up ever so often. Now you put a basic lid on it, but you'll still be blown up ever so often. And I wasn't even talking about Northern Ireland, which I could have just talked about in exactly the same way. It just did not have the arms available to it. Yes, he was given a lot of arms by various individuals, particularly by Gaddafi. But the bottom line is that the recruitment, the numbers, the arms, the countries weren't as large, etc., etc., etc. There's 1.5 million Northern Irishmen. It's not like 30, 40, 50 million people from another, which you would have had if you had the Western Ukraine. So why would he want to take the Western Ukraine? He wouldn't. Nonsense. No interest in the Western Ukraine. He wants the buffer of those eastern regions. And to be fair, I was aware of the agreement that they'd already made, which was basically that those eastern regions can stay in the Ukraine as long as it's a federation and as long as basically the Ukraine is neutral. And what's wrong with neutrality? Neutrality has been great for Sweden. Neutrality has been great for Austria. What's wrong with neutrality? Frankly, neutrality has been great for Ireland. What's wrong with neutrality? So that was the request. Federated country, neutral, East can do its bits. And indeed, I was also aware that the breakaway states had asked Russia, pleaded indeed with Russia, for them to take them into Mother Russia. Well, what this war has created is that they've done exactly that. They've now taken Donetsk, etc., into Mother Russia. So they're now parts of Russia which will never be released. Crimea had already gone, we knew that. So I'm not even talking about Crimea because it had already gone. 99% Russian anyhow. So the bottom line I'm saying is any person who knew anything about geopolitics and knew about the circumstances in Russia and in the Ukraine should have been able to say, number one, Ukraine can't win this. Number two, by the other, Putin went in light. The only surprise to me, and to be fair, if you listen to my first podcast, it wasn't a surprise. Because what I said was, Putin does not, and I said it, and believe me, just go back and listen. And this is over 1.5 years ago. I said it, Putin does not want to cause deaths in the Ukraine. So therefore, he's going in very light. There is no shock and awe. When we went into Iraq, it was shock and awe. I.e. explosions going off everywhere, buildings being blown up, degrading totally the infrastructure, particularly the power supplies, military, communications, etc., etc., etc. Degraded all of it due to the air war. Russia did none of that. None of it. None of it. Made no attempt to do that in any way, shape or means. Had all of the capacity to do it, but made none of the attempt. And I suggested at that time that was probably against some of the advice of some of the more hawks, because there's hawks in Russia too. Some of the hawks in Russia. Now I'm going to leave you with this aspect. And this is what I find why this is so important, that we're again not fooled by the propaganda. Because for most of my life, I was aware that we were on a hair trigger to death. The middle-range rockets that they had, the short-range rockets that they had in Western Europe, meant that actually if a mistake was made, there would be no opportunity to prevent nuclear weapons being fired off. And if they'd been fired off in error, there was no opportunity to not fire yours off in error in case it wasn't error, and in case the then full nuclear arsenal of your opposite power, regardless of which one did it, of your opposite power was fired at you. Now, the truth of the matter is that we're back to that. And we're back to that even worse, because now we include in that, to a stronger level, China. Because America's real enemy is China. Now, China does practically nothing militarily. It has zero interest in the military. Its interest is in building an economy and taking over the economic arms of the world state, which is fair enough, because that's what every country wants to do. We want to sell our goods all around the world and want to be the number one economic power. So does China. Why is it wrong for China wanting to be that? America wants to retain that, retain it. Why is it wrong for China to want to take it? As long as it's not doing it by any means that are incorrect, military means, why is it wrong? So in Africa, examples we were talking about earlier on, unlike people in the West who had those countries for about 100 years, 90 years to 100 years, and didn't build anything other than roads to get the goods which they took out of the ground to the nearest port so it could go back to Europe. China's building roads. China's building schools. It's building railways. It's building infrastructure. So it means that a child who breaks their arm doesn't die of sepsis because it takes them 3 days to get to a hospital. Now it takes them 6 hours, 5 hours, if the nearest hospital's way away in the capital city or whatever. It's doing that. And if the leader of that country is a good guy or gal and say, do this with my people, China builds it with their people. If the leader turns around and says, once you've built this road, this railway, this whatever it might be, this bridge, leave all of your stuff here so we can fix it, it leaves its stuff there. Whatever deal you make with them is a deal they do. They don't care. They don't care. They're not after taking the country over. They're not after putting bases all over the world. China has one base outside of China. The United States, that's hundreds, okay? The United States spends nearly $1 trillion a year. $1 trillion a year on its military. That is more than the next countries who spend, including China, including the United Kingdom that spends a lot of money on its weaponry, including France, including Germany, including Saudi Arabia, including Israel. The next 10 countries below it, the United States spends more than, all put together. So why is the United States saying it's fearful of China making some sort of attack? But why? Why would you be fearful when you're spending practically everything on your armaments? And that's year in, year out. It's not a spike. I believe the Chinese have stood a spike this year. But that spike still keeps it in one of the 10 below the United States. But the United States spends that year in, year out, every year. And has done so for basically 30 years, right? Massive amounts of money on armaments. Why? Why would it do that? Other than it can pretend to be the man that says, in a quiet way, you might want to listen to what we say. Otherwise, we might just cause some strife in your country. Now, the problem is people are no longer buying that. They're not buying that strife will be caused. They're now saying, well, you know what, let's club together. So I said on that first podcast I did about the war in the Ukraine and Russia, I said the biggest mistake the United States has made is the SWIFT system. Is taking that away from Russia. Because now, every country, I care not what country you were in, I care not if you were even an ally, thinks to itself, if we go on the wrong side of the United States, they can basically impound all our money, stop us trading via the SWIFT system, and undermine everything we've done, because two things. One is the SWIFT trading system, and two is the US dollar, because the US dollar is generally kept in their banks. If not, you've got to move the dollar around and it's American currency. So I knew From that point on, I knew it was a must for every other country to turn around and say, we have to get rid of the dollar as the currency of reserve. And then the United States went that step further. And I mentioned this on one of the podcasts as well. It went to Saudi and started to say to Saudi Arabia, you have to follow what we want you to do in terms of aiding the Ukrainian and in terms of pricing the oil. Well, once they said that, that was a problem, because then the Saudis thought, hold on, now we are being told to do something against our interests. So let us uncouple the petrodollar. Let's take it away from the fact that the only currency you can use to buy oil in is the dollar. No, we're taking that away now from us. We're going to turn around and say, if you want to buy the dollar in RMB, yuan, you can buy it in yuan. If you want to buy it in rubles, buy it in rubles, buy it in whatever. So now that's what's happened. That undermines the dollar. I'm not going to say it's overnight. It's not an overnight flight, but this is the beginning of the end of US monetary hegemony. And that's because actions were carried out incorrectly. All because, basically, and, you know, our former Prime Minister of 3 weeks said it, Liz Truss. She said, we want to degrade Russia. We want to degrade its military. Not we want to liberate Ukraine. We want to degrade Russia. Because the idea was, let's split Russia into its component parts, which is what they were trying to do under Yeltsin. And that man was so drunk he didn't know what he was doing and was happy to do it as long as he got money in his back pocket. Putin's not played that game. From day one, he's not played that game. Putin, if he's anything, is a nationalist. He's not played that game. He brought Russia to its nationalist perspective. He doesn't want to recreate the Soviet Union. There's no advantage in it for him. What he wants to do is basically to keep Russia strong and to keep the natural resources that Russia has. So this is what I mean. When we look at it, and as I say, don't listen to what I'm saying, look it all up. When we look at it sensibly, we can see things. But we're so nonsensical that we buy into things like, oh, Russia's destroyed its own pipeline. It cost them $12 billion to build the pipeline and they're going to blow it up. Come on! Even though you heard the American president say, two in fact, Trump and Biden said, this will never come on stream. So you're hearing that. You heard both presidents say that. You heard Victoria Nuland then when it was blown up say, great, fantastic. But you still don't want to believe it. That it was the United States. Maybe with a little help from you know who that might be, the nearest sidekick. But the bottom line is this. Why would you not believe it? Why would you think that Russia blows up its own pipeline? When, of course, if it didn't want the Germans to have gas or oil, all it needed to do was just turn it off. Because the sources come from there. So just turn it off. And in time, the Germans will say, all right, well, we do need it. And you turn it back on again. And you raise the price. But no, what do we do instead? We take away, the US blows up the pipeline, and then you have it blown up the pipeline of a country that is meant to be a staunch ally. I don't know why the Germans aren't saying anything. I just don't understand it. But the Germans aren't saying anything. They're hiding it, trying to pretend it's not them. The Swedes said, we know who's done it, but we won't say it's not in our national interest. Well, you know if it was Russians, they'd be saying it straight away who did it. The Danes are saying it's not in our national interest. We know who's done it. Well, if it was, they'd know. So now we had the Psyops report from the Times, from his Substack, and you had the White House saying, "Oh, it's rubbish what he's writing." But all of a sudden, then we start hearing, "Oh, it was the Ukrainians that did it." All of a sudden, the Germans find Ukrainians may have done it. So Ukrainians are being thrown under a bus now. Ukrainians did it. What a joke. Look, the reality is we all know who's done it, who's got any understanding of it. And we all know what damage that has done to the German economy because it's no longer got all of the cheap energy that it needs to run its manufacturing, because Germany lives off that. That's gone. And soon the German people will start saying, hang on, where's my job going? Luckily, we had a mild winter. What happens when it isn't a mild winter this year? So, ladies and gentlemen, all I wanted to do was to give you a view, to give you some understanding of how you can be made to believe things, even though the opposite is true. And to be fair, even though if you're a thinker, you know the opposite's true. But you can be made to believe them. And that is what Psyops are about in the secret world. That is how revisionism is played. Yeah. To whose advantage is it? The problem is it doesn't only always sit in the hands of the state. So now you can get revisionism from anywhere, and all states are playing at it. It isn't as though the Ruskies aren't playing that game. Of course they are. They're playing that game against the West. And that's what becomes dangerous, because that will aim at the West and they'll get that perspective. And the West is playing that game against them. And it becomes a free-for-all. And it becomes a belief that, some people might say, well, I'm going to fight for my country. So you get the perspective whereby Poles have apparently joined the army and are willing, supposedly, how willing I don't know, but are willing to go into the Ukraine to support the Ukrainian, so the Polish military. The Lithuanian military is presumably, they say, is willing to go into the Ukraine. What does that mean? Think about it. What does that mean if they go into the Ukraine? Well, what it means is that the Russians will be fighting a NATO army, albeit that they'll say it's nothing to do with NATO, but we know it's a NATO army because they're NATO members. Do they then call on Article 5? Do the Ukrainians do something that makes us defend them? The old First World War blanco check given to the Austrians, the blank check they were given that allowed them to manipulate Germany to come to its defence. Yeah? This is the problem. So if we ever do give the Ukrainians F-16s, do they fly under the radar and start bombing in Moscow? Do they fire off cruise missiles against Moscow? This is the problem. And then that escalates the situation and quickly comes out of control. This is why I was saying in the last bit that the nuclear aspect, and I'll just finish on this. When we hear people say, oh, Putin, he's mad, he might use his nuclear weapons. You do need to understand the only people ever to use nuclear weapons are the American. And the war was over. Don't be fooled by this. The war was over. The bombing campaign that was being done in Japan was doing the job. The regular bombing campaign I'm talking about. And if it didn't, the one nuclear bomb was sufficient. Why the second? Because that wasn't who they were trying to let know about it. They were trying to let the Soviets know that we've got 2, and indeed many more, nuclear bombs, that if you come at us, we can blow you to smithereens and destroy the whole of the world. So Japan wasn't the enemy in that sense. It was just the next enemy to be shown. Because in other words, why didn't they just drop that bomb on Germany? Now, I know they're going to turn around and say, oh, we were already there and defeating the German. Questionable on timings. The reality is there was no need whatsoever. So now what we have is we have a circumstance where the United States have used nuclear weapons, but they're never questioned about it. There's never any question as to whether that was right or wrong. Never. We talk about Putin blowing up civilians, but we were happy to blow up 2 dams with the 633 Squadron, whom we show a movie of every year, and we say that the pilots were great. I'm not calling down the pilots, they were doing their job, and the bombardiers, and the bouncing bombers, yeah, great, they were doing their job, but look at the policy. The policy which said, we will drown all those Germans below that dam. That's it. Has Putin ever thought that? Has he ever done that in the Ukraine? Even considered just killing people en masse, civilians en masse? No. But we did it. We did it in the Hamburg firestorms, in the bombings. So what I'm saying is, once it gets out of hand, anything is possible. So do not, I suggest, fall for everything you read. Do not march blithely into battle without understanding why. Do not look at what the perspectives are as to why we do things, why our nation does things, why our people do things, why our representatives do things. Hold our representatives to account. Why did Boris Johnson go to Zelensky and tell him, do not sue for peace? A peace deal was had within 2 weeks of you may not know this, but look it up again. I keep telling people, look things up. 2 weeks into the end of the beginning of the conflict in the Ukraine, Zelensky was happy to sue for peace under the deal which I told you about, whereby you'd have a federated system in the east, they would all be still part of the Ukraine, and Russia would relinquish its armies as long as Ukraine was neutral. And the thing is, by then, not many people had died and not a lot of destruction was made, because this was all when he was trying to go in very, very light, hoping that a deal could be made, because they just wanted the neutrality of the Ukraine and the buffer zone of the Donbass. Right? That's basically what they wanted. And that was agreed. And the person who went to tell them not to do that, with a message from the US president, was our own, yes, you've got it in one, Prime Minister Boris Johnson. And why did he do that? Not just because he was taking a message from the United States. Because, yeah, okay, so we may well be the United States lucky in many ways. But that wasn't the case. He was in trouble. He was in trouble from Partygate. So he basically did it in order to take people's minds away from Partygate and say, what a great guy Boris is. He's out helping everybody out. He's out helping the Ukraine. More than any other country in the world, he's helping the Ukraine. Well, where has that got us? It's cost the life of 350,000 Ukrainian dead, soldiers that is, by the way, and cost us billions, which we can little afford. That's what it's cost us, to keep Prime Minister Boris Johnson from feeling the heat on Partygate, and to make Britain post-Brexit relevant. So there you go, 3 issues. 1, be a friend of the United States. 2, make post-Brexit Britain relevant in some way, shape or means. And 3, keep Boris in office and out of jail. So those are what it's done. So my friends, look at why things are done. Hope you enjoyed the shows. Hope you will listen again next week when I'll have Fergus back, and we'll probably look at a bit of a lighter subject. See you again, hopefully next week.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes or Google Patreon Black Spy podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe for free.
Here is a working class spy telling his stories, the secrets, the lives of spies. Feel free to message Carlton King on all socials and give this show 5 stars on Apple iTunes and subscribe so you never miss a single episode. For your ears only.
More than a quarter of a century, I was a member of Her Majesty's Secret Intelligence Service.